Well, hello there, and thank you for joining us for a very special edition of Telile 24/7. I'm your host, Adam Cooke, and we're celebrating our 3rd anniversary this week. Yes, it was 3 years ago that Telile 24/7 went on the air. Our very first guests were local autism advocate Taylor Linloff and Cape Breton-Canso Member of Parliament Mike Kellaway. It's become our tradition every time we celebrate a 1-year anniversary for Telile 24/7 to invite one of our fellow members of the Canadian Association of Community Television Users and Stations to join us for an interview. That person for the past 2 years has been Vicki Hogarth, who is the news host and producer for CHCO-TV in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. And we've got Vicki once again this year. We'll catch up with her in just a moment. But we also have a special guest who is the news director of another cactus station in Manitoba. Specifically, Rrain, who heads up the Neepawa Access Community Television News Division. She even spent some time at the Toronto Star before coming back to Neepawa, where she grew up. You're going to hear more of her story in a little while. But first of all, we are pleased to welcome back to our show someone who went from interviewing the likes of Justin Timberlake and the Property Brothers to speaking to mayors and wardens in southwestern New Brunswick. She is Vicki Hogarth. Vicki, welcome back to Telile 24/7. How are things in St. Andrews today?
Great. Well, very cold, but thank you, Adam, for having me back. I love that this is our annual ritual.
Yes, indeed. You know, it's funny how some friends get together over coffee, some send each other letters or texts, and we interview each other. But on a serious note, Vicki, we're glad to have you here to tell us a little bit about what you and your CHCO colleagues are doing right now. What kind of programs are you working on these days?
Well, I would say the biggest adjustment from last time we spoke, when you and I started the LJI program, I think we were 6 weeks in and the world shut down and we had to immediately pivot in COVID. And being that we're maritime provinces, I think you and I both had I was in every single COVID-19 update for our province for 2 years, really. I just had, your Facebook memories when they pop up and show you what was happening a year ago. This morning, I had this one pop up that said all COVID-19 restrictions will be removed, and it had a date for March sometime. And I said, wow, that's like weird to think about. That was just a year ago that we were still living like that. And so really, the last year has been interesting because it's kind of been this, I had been at CHCO prior to the LGI program. I just didn't work here full time like I do now. So it's the first time that I've sort of been using my production schedule to not just be doing a ton of COVID and government updates and getting back to regular programming that you film out in the world. So I had I've always done Newsbreak 26 since I've been here, and it's a weekly newscast, and it just gives the highlights for Southwest New Brunswick. And then Southwest Magazine is a long format interview show where I'm able to speak more in depth. I film it often in the studio. But an example of one that I've done outside of the studio this year is going to Rrain is an island in southwest New Brunswick that's about an hour and a half ferry ride just to get there. So I don't really expect people to come to our studio from Rrain, and it's nice to film on location. So we recently filmed in the fall on Swallowtail Lighthouse. It's this beautiful, beautiful lighthouse that's super historic, but needs a lot of restoration work. So we went there we stayed overnight at the lighthouse and filmed and interviewed the lightkeeper and all the people who are part of the restoration process, and the mayor, and people with attachment to the history of the lighthouse. So that's when we've taken that show on the road to do, and that's been kind of the pleasure of this past year. It's just getting back out into the world and not feeling so stuck in studio, especially when you live somewhere like here and where you do on Cape Breton, where it's just everything is a set when the ocean is right there. So it's been nice to get back out into the world and do that. And then we do a Your Town Matters show, which is interviews with the mayors of all the communities we cover. And one thing that did happen in New Brunswick this past fall and into winter was that we had province-wide amalgamation. So a lot of the communities that we're used to covering either absorbed neighboring communities and became bigger, or their councils completely dissolved and they became totally new communities. So that's been, not only did we cover all the people running for council in all these communities and mayor, but now we're covering basically brand new councils in a lot of ways, or in the case of a town like St. Andrews, where they took in the neighboring two communities, Shamcook and Bayside, and became a bigger council and added 3 councillors to them. So that's been like it's shocking to me how exciting I find municipal politics, because I think a younger version of myself would have thought, back when I was doing entertainment stories, really, that's going to be like your thrill of the week, going to town council, but it actually is. It's where stuff happens that actually affects your life.
Well, you know something, Vicki? One of my favorite quotes about TV news is from Moses Znaimer, the TV mastermind who set up Chum TV and Much Music in Toronto. I remember years ago hearing him say, "The best television newscast tells me what happened to me today." And it's certainly what we strive to do here at Telile, and it sounds like it's what you folks try to do at CHCO, even though the recent municipal reforms and amalgamations in New Brunswick have probably made that a little more interesting and a little more challenging.
And it's still ongoing, because now that they've amalgamated, that's not without its hiccups for the next year as they deal with how do bylaws apply to areas that used to be local service districts, now that they're actually part of a municipality now. So they're navigating all of that, and some are thrilled and some are not so thrilled in terms of the residents. So it's interesting. It keeps things interesting for sure. We also had the opportunity this year, which I was really excited about, to do an end of year with the Premier. We were on their invite list, which was so exciting. So we went up to Fredericton just around Christmas time and did a year in review in the Premier's office for half an hour. So that was one of my highlights too this year.
Well, I'm glad you got some FaceTime with the Premier, Vicki. I'd like to go back to the conversation we were having about the changes to municipal units in southwestern New Brunswick and how that's affected the CHCO-TV broadcasts of complete council meetings.
Where do I start? What makes it easier is that, I suppose the one thing that would make it easier is that there are less councils to cover in terms of communities. The thing that makes it more challenging is the new councils tend to have a minimum of 8 councillors. So in terms of operating cameras, it means it's always a minimum 2 to 3 person job. So we rely heavily on volunteers anyway at CHCO, but it's just making sure we orchestrate who's going to what meeting, because we always need multiple hands on deck to do it properly. So Flo and I call ourselves the Thelma and Louise, and Flo's in the LGI program here too. The Thelma and Louise of Town Council, because we hit the road with cameras, mics, everything you can imagine. And depending on what community we're going to, we're meeting different volunteers, which is neat, because Eastern Charlotte, for instance, which used to be Blacks Harbour and St. George, those 2 councils dissolved, and then they incorporated communities like Back Bay, Penfield, Lake Utopia, Bonnie River, and became this really big community. So we have a guy named Dale Wells who lives in Blacks Harbour, he used to help us with Blacks Harbour. Now he comes with us to Eastern Charlotte and helps us out there. So it's not that it's harder, because I think it's something we've always tried to do, is really involve the community in the production. And some people love town council, and you know, the kind of people that you see sitting in every meeting, every once in a while they're like, can I help with this? And it makes them feel part of the storytelling of their community. And so we've always involved that, but we've sort of had to rely heavily on that now, where we do a check every week to make sure who's coming with us where. And then we're still navigating a town called St. Stephen that's pretty much the biggest community, and it was before amalgamation. And this is going to be the first year they're actually on TV, because we've had trouble in the past navigating their council room. I think people think you just show up with one camera and why isn't it on TV? No, there's miking issues, there's multiple camera issues, there's lighting issues. We went with one camera this week and just tried to film as best we could the council room, but we've met with the chief administrative officer, and the council's agreed to buy some microphones, some extra cameras and stuff for their council chamber. That's going to next level our production of St. Stephen Town Council so we can actually get it on TV. Right now we're just putting it on YouTube because the quality is not quite there with one camera for television. So we're just making it available to people on YouTube, but we're waiting for next month to bring the TV production up to a new level. But I mean, it's definitely like town council. It's so important to us to get it out there for people. But it's a big production. It's a lot of people. So if you mean let's say there's 8 counselors, and I will say St. Andrews is smaller, but they have 9 counselors. So, but St. Stephen, Eastern Charlotte, here's my example. There's 8 counselors, a mayor, then you have the chief administrative officer as well as a town clerk there. Then there's also a mic for the community because there's always that period in the end when they're allowed to go up and air their grievances or say their piece, whatever it happens to be. So there's a lot of people that are potentially on camera or are definitely on camera every meeting. So it's definitely quite a large scale production.
Well, I know you've got a hard-working crew trying to get around those difficult parts of covering council meetings, Vicki. And we want to give a shout out to our own folks here at Telile Community Television who work so hard covering the regular monthly meetings and Committee of the Whole meetings for Richmond Municipal Council in Ayrshire. Nick Boudreau, who is one of the senior folks here at Telile, has been working hard on camera and sound ever since he first arrived here at the station, and it's not unusual that Nick will be walking around on his hands and knees underneath the desks at Richmond Municipal Council chambers, installing the microphones to make sure that everything is in top shape when the cameras start rolling and our live streaming begins. And I also want to say a special thank you to Callan Cowan, who is one of the newcomers here at Telile. He's really taken to everything that needs to be done in terms of camera operation, sound, video editing, film formatting. He's been a great asset to not only the council coverage, but also to Telile as a whole. I wanted to pick up on something that you and your CHCO colleagues are doing right now that really has me interested, Vicki. It looks like you folks are doing some broadcasting at a special place for me in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, just on the border with Calais, Maine. My wife Kathy and I went there when we visited the area in 2013. We went to Carmen's Diner, and I have to tell you, those are some of the best milkshakes in all of Atlantic Canada. So I was very pleased to see that you and CHCO are doing some shooting at Carmen's these days.
And this is some breaking CHCO news. We are launching a new show that's based in St. Stephen. Because it's nice we do a lot in studio, but it's nice to get out there into the community and base something in another community that we consider part of our coverage zone. So we are filming a show at Carmen's, Adam, if you can believe it. John Higgins is one of our community producers here, and he's had a talk show in the past that in COVID he kind of put on the back burner for a while, and he wants to relaunch it, but we said let's do it in St. Stephen this time because he's really a voice of St. Stephen. He used to be on the radio in St. Stephen for quite some time, so he's a really well-known local personality, very attached to the St. Stephen area. So we thought, why don't we put him as a local icon in an establishment that's a local icon. So the fact that you know Carmen's tells me that we are on the right page here.
I can still taste the milkshakes right now, and the burgers too. Well, I'm excited that you and John Higgins are going to be doing some filming at Carmen's and St. Stephen's. I hope it goes well.
So what are some of the new shows you've been working on, and how have you navigated that? I mean, I don't want to say post-COVID, but in some ways, in terms of like production, it is. We're not limited the way we were for the first 2 years of LJI. There were days when I was really the only one in the studio, right? Where Zoom was like the only way you could do a lot of your interviews. How have you sort of pivoted from COVID times to working without restrictions?
Well, we're certainly out of the most restrictive parts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're actually coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the Nova Scotia government releasing us from all COVID-19 and social distancing restrictions. That's on March 21st that we celebrate that anniversary. But we're still taking precautions when necessary. When any of our Telile staff has any symptoms of COVID-19 or any other airborne disease, we mask up when we're going out in public. And we've had several people on our show in recent weeks to talk about not only COVID-19, which is still in some pockets of Nova Scotia right now, but also respiratory viruses and the latest one, norovirus, that's made its way back into the province. We've had Nova Scotia's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Robert Strang, on our show during his most recent media availabilities provided by the province of Nova Scotia. And we've spoken to a couple of people about the local effects of COVID-19 and respiratory viruses. Paul Landry, who is the head of the Strait Regional Centre for Education, formerly the Strait Regional School Board, talking a little bit about how absentee rates are affected among students and staff by respiratory viruses, including COVID-19. And as well, we've had a retired physician who's invested himself in the COVID-19 situation over the past 3 years, Dr. Robert Martel of West Arishat. We've greatly appreciated his perspective as well. But we're getting out there. We're going and covering different municipal council meetings, most notably Richmond County and the neighboring town of Port Hawkesbury. We do that for our regular one-hour shows, Telile 24/7 and Roundtable. Roundtable is more of a panel discussion show, so we also have multiple person conversations in that particular show as well. And we're getting out to various parts of our community to film different meetings and different events that we feel are relevant to the people here. A big example of that is the recent municipal boundary review that Richmond County underwent. The Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board asks that of municipalities all over the province every 8 years. And it was Richmond County's turn once again to take a look at the number of councillors that it wanted and where the district boundaries would be for those councillors. So we brought our cameras out to meetings in different parts of Richmond County. We're very happy to have shared the perspectives not only of the individual councillors, but of community residents. And that's something that we're going to continue to do here at Telile, just like you folks do so well at CHCO-TV in St. Andrews.
Now, we found our audience grew astronomically in COVID, and I think it was for a number of reasons. One being that we're extremely local. A lot of people, if they didn't know us, they knew where they could find us in a lot of ways. So and there is that trust with a super local news source, right? That you know that it's not being, anchored in a different province, or that a journalist isn't sort of just coming to the scene and then leaving. We're actually here. So we found trust grew that way. People could reach us too. They could email us. We responded. And then there's just the fact that because we're so used to being a skeleton team, like that's just how we do a lot of things, we weren't really held back by COVID in the sense that we could continue producing because we were so used to producing without all the smoke and mirrors of a big studio. We were just so used to doing it already. So we were producing, we were never held back by it. We were still on the air. We were doing new content. It was easy to do the COVID updates. I sat here in a studio by myself, and Patrick, it was just Patrick and me at the time, our station manager. He'd be dealing with the live elements in the back room, and I'd have my questions ready, talking to the Chief Medical Officer and Premier, and we actually adjusted so easily that our audience more than doubled. I mean, I think it quadrupled in a lot of ways, and thankfully a lot of those people have stayed with us and are continuing to, even though we're in Southwest New Brunswick. I was at an event on last weekend where it was a lot of people from Fredericton, Moncton, and St. John, and I couldn't get over the number of the people that came up to introduce themselves to us and said they'd been watching since the pandemic, but that they're still watching what we produce, and it helps to be a small province because Nova Scotia is, I'm sure, the same. What happens in Cape Breton would still be interesting to someone in Halifax, right?
Well, one of the biggest ways we've been finding out who's watching and who's engaging with our content is by checking out our social media feeds. Telile is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and we've had a lot of new subscribers to those services, particularly on YouTube and Twitter over the last little while, and people have really been commenting on and liking and sharing our posts, even when they're not specifically video camera footage, because sometimes you just take out your tablet and your device and you get some on-the-spot recordings of different events. For instance, back in September, Hurricane Fiona was making its way through Nova Scotia and through our part of Cape Breton Island. So I decided to go out in Port Hawkesbury and just use my phone to film a short video giving an update on what it was like in terms of conditions across the Canso Causeway and the downpour that was kicking off on the Friday night of that pivotal weekend back in September. I posted that on all our social channels, and I even got a response on Twitter from somebody who came on and said, "I don't know who this guy is, but he doesn't blink his eyes for 2.5 minutes." So, what do you know? I have another marketable skill to go with all my news coverage. So, we've been finding out, even in humorous times like that we can reach people in ways we never thought might have happened, even as recently as 5 to 10 years ago.
I imagine Hurricane Fiona was, you didn't really, I mean, as soon as COVID was dying down, then that happened in Nova Scotia. We didn't really feel it in this part of New Brunswick. It was just a really stormy weekend. But how did you navigate Fiona?
Well, we were very fortunate here in this part of Cape Breton Island. We were very lucky that Hurricane Fiona didn't strike us with great ferocity as it did in places like the Sydney area and the Cape Breton Highlands. But we did see some damage caused in specific areas. I went out with my TV camera in the rain during the weekend of Fiona and described what things were like along the Canso Causeway and the Port Hawkesbury waterfront. And we had some follow-up coverage from Richmond County. A couple who lived just up the road from Telile Community Television's headquarters, Janasta and Vincent Chesson, had their trailers severely damaged and thus lost their living quarters where they had had for the past 20 years, raising their son and even bringing their grandson back in for a little while. But that story did have a happy ending. A GoFundMe page was set up for them. It went spectacularly well. Community fundraisers both here in Isle Madame and also across Nova Scotia and even outside the Maritimes also contributed to help the Chessons, and they had a new trailer moved to the area and rebuilt for them. They certainly won't replace all the memories of the old trailer, but we're glad to see that they have their new home, and we're glad to have been a part of bringing light to this difficult issue that the Chessons and people like them were facing in the aftermath of Fiona. But before we let you go, Vicki, I just wanted to check in with you about a special visit that two members of our Telile staff paid to you and station manager Patrick Watt this past summer. Becky Borono, our station manager, and one of our key video and sound people, Nick Boudreau, made the trip to St. Andrews, and they visited you two over at CHCO-TV. So tell us a little bit about that and about welcoming the Telile delegation to CHCO.
Oh, it was wonderful to have Nick and Becky here. I mean, we consider you a sister station and on so many different levels, because I think that the struggle of being, I mean, we're very passionate about what we do, and the way we involve the community in telling local stories and keeping it hyper local. There's not many people that understand the experience of what it is you do at a community station, because there's frankly not that many true community stations left in Canada. There's maybe 9 or 10 that are like Telile and like CHCO, when there used to be hundreds, and that's it's hard to explain that to other people. It's also hard to explain the way that we work within the community to anyone who doesn't fully understand what it means to be like a non-profit community television station. And so it was neat to have them there for that. I know that they took a lot of tips from Patrick and Flo on the tech side, and they enjoyed their week here. But for me, it was just neat to talk to someone who understands what it's like to work at a place similar to this one and deal with the struggles of staying alive, and also, making sure you're online and live streaming things and hitting all the different notes that I think any TV station struggles with, how to continue to be relevant on every single platform that's available. Like we were just saying, TikTok, I'm like, oh my gosh, here's another one for it, right? But yeah, I really truly appreciate that, because I think that not many people approach media the way a community station does, and it's such an important thing that we do that I wish we could be a model for more communities to do similar things, like what we do and like what you do back where you live, especially in the time we're living in, where there's not only such a mistrust of media, we're also seeing a lot of media, big time media, still dying off. You and I were talking about this earlier.
Yes, that's right, Vicki. And we were talking just before this interview started about how traditional media is struggling these days, and how that makes it even more important for stations like Telile and CHCO to jump in and fill the gaps when they start to appear in the traditional media landscape. Richmond Municipal Council even brought this to the council table because Saltwire Media had stopped regular home delivery of two of their flagship daily newspapers, the Chronicle Herald serving the province and the Cape Breton Post. Several communities in Richmond County and even the town of Port Hawkesbury weren't able to get both of these papers delivered to their homes anymore, having them replaced by digitized versions. So that has come to light. As well, Acadia Broadcasting, which is owned by J.D. Irving and Associates, has laid off a number of different people at its stations all the way around the Maritimes, including one right here in the Strait area, Port Hawkesbury's 1015 The Hawk, having a job loss there. So it's been difficult to watch all this, Vicki, and I know that that's been the case for you folks in New Brunswick as well, seeing how corporate-owned, monopoly-owned newspapers and traditional media sources are struggling to keep going, but also exposing the cracks in corporate-owned media.
I'll give you an example here in New Brunswick this year. We saw Post Media buy, now it's always been criticized that the English language newspapers, all but one, which is the Courier, that's actually, I think it's just one. The Courier, which weirdly enough is based here in the Charlotte County area. Like the Telegraph Journal, Times and Transcript, the Daily Gleaner, and then a bunch of other weeklies in smaller communities were owned by Irving, basically, for a really long time. And that was highly criticized because if one family, one company, a very powerful family and company that has a lot of different business ventures owns most of the English language media, then how much are they controlling the message and what gets out there, especially maybe criticism of their own companies. Or things like, for instance, I know an issue like glyphosate spraying. It's like a herbicide that's sprayed in forests, and since they're so heavily involved in the forestry industry, it's often been said that not much coverage of that ends up in any Irving-owned paper. Well, since then, it's been sold off to Post Media, which is obviously not even New Brunswick-based. Jamie Irving, I will say, though, is chair of the board of he's the head of the board of Post Media, so there's still a connection going on there. But since this Post Media takeover, it hasn't taken that much time for them to go from being basically a daily paper, except for Sunday, to next week, starting March 1st, they will only be printed 3 days a week. So they'll be printed Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. They say they'll still have an online presence, but you know, when you make that much of a cutback, it has people concerned about where's the state of news in New Brunswick. So, I mean, I take what we do seriously here because New Brunswick's already such a news desert. So when you see something like this happen, yeah, it's scary. I feel like our role is all the more important, especially in our area, which is already overlooked by more mainstream media a lot of the time because we're small. So, you know, if someone is relying, especially in a newspaper industry, if hits become important, which they often do, a lot of journalists and anyone who's worked in print before, myself included, has sometimes had to show, okay, what were my most hit on stories from the week before. And so talking about a small town or different small towns in southwest New Brunswick might not be the most popular story of the day. So it oftentimes can get overlooked, and the same goes for mainstream television. So yeah, but I take our role seriously the more and more I see stuff like that happen. And it tends to happen a lot in the Maritimes just because our population is so small.
Well, with that in mind, Vicki, we're very grateful that folks like you and Patrick at CHCO-TV in St. Andrews are showing us the way in terms of community news broadcasting. And I'm very pleased that you've received some recognition for that. You and Patrick Watt, the station manager, and your husband each received Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee medals in the last couple of months. We were very excited to hear all of that, and we certainly can't think of more deserving recipients than you two for all the work that you and your team do at CHCO to make sure the stories get out. So Vicki Hogarth, it's a pleasure to talk to you once again. Thank you so much for joining me once again for an anniversary edition of Telile 24/7.
Thanks, Adam. That was fun.
Thanks once again to Vicki Hogarth. And now we're going to shift our focus on Telile 24/7 from southwestern New Brunswick all the way out to Manitoba. That's where you'll find Rrain Pryor. She's the news director at Neepawa Access Community Television, another member of the Canadian Association of Community Television Users and Stations, just like Telile. Now, her journey took her all the way to the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest daily newspaper, But Rrain Pryor felt Neepawa calling her home, and that's where we find her today as we connect with her via Zoom for this special edition of Telile 24/7. Let's hear Rrain Pryor's unique story of her journey in journalism right now. And we're pleased to be joined here on Telile Community Television by the news director and the local journalism initiative participant for Neepawa Access Community TV, NACT. She is Rrain Pryor. Rrain, thank you for joining us all the way from Manitoba today.
It is my pleasure to be here. It's nice to talk to you.
Great to have you along, and we're very happy to share the stories of our fellow members of the Canadian Association of Community Television Users and Stations, or CACTUS for short, of course. I wanted to get a sense from you as to your history with the program and with NACT in the first place. How did you get involved?
I was a volunteer with the station going kind of a ways back. And before I started as an LJI journalist, I was also the director of the community center in Neepawa. So I was interviewee many times on the station for, community activities and things like that. Any kind of programs we had, classes, art shows. So I was very familiar kind of with what the station was looking for in town. And then I came on to LJI about a year and a half into the program. So it wasn't right at the beginning. I kind of joined a little bit later. During COVID, when I think a lot of people had a bit of a career shift during COVID as things shut, things opened.
Yes.
But I actually came from a news background. I worked at the Toronto Star back before I moved back to my hometown, which is Neepawa. So I had that background, hadn't been using it. This opportunity came up and it just really seemed to combine everything that I had been doing with my life up to this point, and kind of just took it from there. So I've been at this for about 2 years now. I think just coming up on 2 years in July.
So I'm dying to know how someone goes from working at the Toronto Star to coming back to a smaller town in Manitoba. What's been the comparison for you? And do you feel that you're basically coming back to where you might have felt you should have been all along? And just tell us a little bit about the journey from Toronto back to Neepawa.
It was interesting, actually. It wasn't a journey I'd planned to make. I was one of those people who left my hometown after high school. I'm like, I'm never going back. Never going back there. I'm done. Big city for me. And I moved to Winnipeg, and then I moved on to Toronto at the Toronto Star. Now around the 2011, 2012 mark in newspaper publishing, like print publishing specifically, layoffs we were losing entire departments, including the department I was in. I managed to hang on for about a year past that, just covering a mat leave for someone else. And then I was kind of, that was it for my Toronto Star career. I was freelancing a bit. And I've been in communication with my family. My family all lives in Manitoba and all in the area. And my mom had always wanted me to come back home and be closer. And that was around the time that my brothers started having families. I started having nieces and nephews very young. And it just seemed like the right time to come back. I planned to come back for a few years, and this is, 10 years later, and here I am.
Blink and all of a sudden 10 years have gone by. So
it really is like that.
What do you think you carry from your time in Toronto to how you're applying it to journalism here? I mean, obviously it's two very different beasts. For one thing, it's broadcast instead of print. And for another thing, obviously it's a much smaller area. But what do you think you brought from your experience at the Toronto Star that you're putting into play here in Neepawa?
Well, I think when you're working in a place like the Toronto Star, where, you're passing through a newsroom, there's, 100 journalists in there, you're drawing from all these people. You're drawing from their experiences and not just what you're doing yourself. Now, while I was at the Star, I was actually not doing the print. I was doing their online stuff, things like breaking news galleries, videos, things like that, the multimedia. So I bring a lot of that forward as well to this. Absolutely. And it's not as different as you necessarily think it is, because even in a place like Toronto, you're looking for those community stories. You're looking for those personal stories that people want to hear about.
Well, I will say too, it's kind of interesting that you have the Toronto Star connection there, because we in Richmond County in Cape Breton have a Toronto Star connection as well. We have a friend of ours from Lewisdale named Amy Dempsey, who's been a staff writer for the Star for many years. So
really,
it's just kind of wonderful that this kind of path intersected for you and
Yep.
for her as well too. So
Yep.
we've been very interested to follow Amy's particular adventures from afar working for the Star. So
Oh,
it's
I'm
been great.
sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about Neepawa. And I'm sure you love to
All
talk about
right.
Neepawa, or you wouldn't be doing journalism for it. So can you tell us a little bit about the community itself? Paint us a bit of a snapshot. Tell us a little bit about what the economy's like, what life is like there,
Sure.
general population. What can you tell us about Neepawa?
The main thing about Neepawa is that, I mean, even if you haven't heard of this place across the country, which I'm sure a lot of people have not, it's actually a really exciting place to be right now. When I grew up in this town, I went to high school in this town, and we had a population at that point, let's say about 3,400. It had been 3,400 for about 80 years. It just had not changed for 80 years. Right around 2010, we have a hog processing plant here, was bought out by High Life, began to expand, and they began recruiting from overseas. Now, the population of Neepawa, I would say, 2010 it was about 3,400. Today it is over 6,000,
Wow.
and that gain is almost entirely through immigration and families settling here. So they estimate, 30 to 35% of the town now is of Filipino origin, whether they had immigrated here from the Philippines or were born here to Filipino families. And in the schools, it's even higher percentage, probably more than half at this point. So the schools, we built a new school in the last 10 years. We just got a government commitment, and they've started broken ground on a new, $120 million hospital here. So the community has just, in all ways, there's new businesses going up all the time right now. So it's just really in a boom, which makes it really exciting to be here because there's so many stories to tell.
It sounds like there's a lot happening in
Yeah,
Neepawa right now. That's fantastic.
all the time. And in Manitoba, in the wintertime, to see this much construction is not common. You don't want to be building in January, February in Manitoba if you
Mm.
don't have to be.
No, I hear you. I hear you on
I
that
tell you,
for
we've been hitting
sure.
like minus 30, minus 35 this week, so it's been a little rough.
Oh my goodness. We had minus 26 with a wind chill of minus 35 just 2 weekends ago. So that sounds downright tropical compared to what you folks have been experiencing. So more power to you for keeping
There's
it rolling
always one
along.
point every winter. You get that low.
It's interesting you talk about the Philippine population because we're seeing that happen regularly here in our part of Cape Breton,
Yeah.
the town of Port Hawkesbury in particular, but also Richmond County here where we're broadcasting from. And as a matter of fact, there's a Strait Area Filipino Society that has regular events. And on a couple of occasions now, the mayor of the town of Port Hawkesbury, Brenda Chisholm Beaton, has actually had a flag raising outside of the town's main civic center that raises the Filipino flag and keeps it up there for a few weeks. So
Oh,
they're
nice.
very valued in our community. So I'm glad
Mhm.
to hear that that's the case for you folks in Neepawa as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just an integral part of the community at this point. Just with the number of, I mean, sports leagues that have come up and activities and new organizations. Our churches are booming now because we've had a lot of influx of people. So it's just been all around, been really positive for the community.
So can you tell me a little bit about some of the programming that you're doing over at NACT at Neepawa Access Community Television? What are you involved in directly and what is your team involved in right now?
Okay, so our station is a broadcast station. We are carried across the country, which is different, I think, from a lot of the smaller stations. I know you are as well. I think there's about three or
Yes.
four of us in the LJI program that are carried by Bell, and here it's also MTS and Westman Cable, and we broadcast 24 hours a day. So we have a lot of time to fill. So we do a lot outside of what I do, which I'll get to in a moment. We do a lot of sports coverage. We do a lot of arts coverage. Anytime we are a very musical community. There's concerts all the time. So, we have a specifically Filipino basketball league with like 24 teams. So every weekend there's basketball, there's hockey. We have a junior hockey team
Mhm.
that we cover. So that is a lot of what we're doing. And then from my side, we've started several new programs through LJI. One of the ones it's going into we're calling it the second season now. We've never actually had seasons of TV before. We're calling it the second season of a program called The Decision Makers, where I've been interviewing, town policymakers, people who are involved higher level in organizations, and really the people who are making the decisions for what happens in the community. And talking to them on a personal level, just to see, okay, so we understand the people behind these decisions. We understand where their point of view is coming from rather than just seeing these decisions happen. So we're just starting this month with our new town council, which was elected last October,
Okay.
and kind of starting the process again of getting to know these people. So that's one of, I think, one of the ones that I developed first, and I'm very proud of. But we do a lot of interviewing of people in the community, just about various activities, because there's so many fundraisers going on, there's so many special events going on, there's so many organizations that we want to get to know. So we do a lot of that as well. And then I cover council meetings, 3 different council meetings. So not just the town of Neepawa, but the surrounding municipalities, which I think is something that a lot of us in more rural areas are doing as well, is we aren't just one insular place. We have a catchment area that we're trying to cover as well.
Mm-hmm.
And from those meetings, I always find interesting tidbits to follow up on. One of the stories I'm pursuing right now is just, funding for fire departments. And why does our fire departments have to have bake sales and pancake breakfast to pay for basic equipment? This is a question that I get to ask and I get to pursue with this job. So that's the kind of stuff, the kind of programming that we're doing through LJI.
Well, I'm glad to hear all of that. And it's interesting to hear about the connectivity between the towns, because we find that's the case here in the Strait area between Richmond County and the neighboring town of Port Hawkesbury. And that's particularly true because a lot of Richmond County's heavy industry that provides much of its commercial tax base is based in a community called Point Tupper that's just kitty corner to the town of Port Hawkesbury. So they require a lot of Port Hawkesbury's services. There's also economic spin-off for the town. But one of the biggest stories that we covered in the early times of the LJI program here at Telile was that Richmond County and the town of Port Hawkesbury had struck a new 10-year deal for Port Hawkesbury's volunteer fire department to provide fire services to the community of Point Tupper. And that followed some rancorous discussion between the two councils, so that there was a new spirit of cooperation that came out of that. But it's just interesting to see how you have 2 different municipalities that can be intertwined and really have the 2 of them working together. And I'm sure you find that with the municipalities over in your neck of the woods in Neepawa as well.
Yeah, there's the town of Neepawa, and then we have 3 municipalities who border us, one of which I haven't had the opportunity to cover yet, at least not extensively. And they are partners in a lot of different projects, a lot of economic development projects they partner in. And just geographically, when you have like a wilderness trail, well, it goes through these different areas. So you kind of have to join together in these things. So they're very closely entwined. Like, they're all obviously independent and they make their own decisions. They have their own council and their mayor or their reeve in the case of municipalities. But there are just so many joint projects, and you really, local organizations often will go to all of the different ones, especially if they're looking for support and things like that, because there's just so much intertwined economies, really.
Now, I wonder, Rrain, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like when you and your crew from NACT started showing up with cameras and with microphones and saying, we'd like to interview you, we'd like to cover your council meetings a little more, we'd like to really dig into the various issues? Because we got mostly positive response here at Telile when we started doing that. I mean, we already had a reputation of providing coverage from gavel to gavel of Richmond Municipal Council's meetings. People can still see them on our YouTube channel. We're live streaming them now as well. But what was it like when you started expanding the coverage that NACT was already doing and reaching out to these other municipalities?
There was a little bit of resistance, I got to tell you. Now, we'd been covering the Neepawa Town Council for a while, but we hadn't been covering any of the municipalities. And so I kind of called them up, and it took a bit of convincing even for that first meeting for me to show up. And they were like, well, we should check the bylaws. We need to make sure you're allowed to do this. I'm like, it's a public meeting. I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to do this. But they wanted to be very cautious. And I have noticed a little bit of change, like in the meetings. Not that they're more reserved, but they have tightened up their meetings. Whereas the meeting used to they used to visit and do things like that during the meetings, and maybe it would stretch out to 4 or 5 hours. Now you're having a 2 3 hour meeting that's really tightened up.
Uh,
So I think that's beneficial for them as well.
Well, I mean, people would rather be in a 3 hour meeting than a 5 hour meeting. I think
Yeah.
that's pretty much straightforward. Yes, yes. So, well, whether or not that's your presence there or whether it's NACT's presence there, that might wind up being just as well for everybody then.
Yeah.
There we go. Can you tell me a little bit about the people that you have around you now, Rrain? Because obviously it's not just a one-person show at NACT. So, can you
No,
tell
it's
us a
not.
little bit about the crew you have with you working to make these programs come together?
Absolutely. Now, way back, like NACTV has been around since 77. And back in the beginning, it was a one-person show. I mean, it was, volunteers plus one staff member. And right up until about that 10 years ago, Mark, maybe 15 years ago, one staff member. And, more volunteers maybe than we have now, but one staff member.
Mm.
And programming probably about 13 hours a day. We weren't just on a 24-hour schedule at that point. And then they went to two. This is before my time as well. They had the admin and the sort of manager, and then the technical person, because there's a lot of equipment involved when you're doing broadcast television. And then they got a summer student once in a while. So then there was three, and then I came on board, and then there was four, and now we have 5 people plus a summer student, because we brought someone on to do advertising, because we need to pay for these people that we have here. So I work very closely with Liwai, who's on the front, and she does a lot of our filming. She is from the Filipino community in town, and she's also does translation and subtitles for some of our videos that are in Tagalog, which is a really valuable resource to have.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then Jeremy's on tech, and he's in the back end. And then we brought on, we had a student who used to do filming for our hockey games. And, for extra credit. And then we brought her on, we paid her to do hockey games after she graduated. And now she's working here about half time doing editing. Just straight up, we've filmed this much stuff. We have no time to put it together. Here you go. And, getting young people doing that is great, because they know what they're doing. And then we brought Anne on as well, and doing a part-time advertising. Because we do have some advertisers interested. We're not certainly like a big station where, you have commercial breaks every 10 minutes. But we do have a few regular advertisers, and we'd love to have more, just to kind of, pay for what we're doing. And then we have all our volunteers. And, a lot of people, grabbing a camera. We have cameras you can check out, film an event, film church, film, whatever you want to be doing. And film your road trip, film whatever. And we have people who contribute that kind of stuff. And then we have people we can call on, we need to cover this meeting. It's a sit down job. You just have to kind of go and film for a couple hours. And there's people who prefer that kind of a volunteer opportunity. And we have volunteer interviewers. We have people, doing that. So, it takes a big team to get everything done.
It does, definitely, but it seems like your team is producing all kinds of terrific programming. We get to see it regularly on the national news portal for Cactus, for the Canadian Association of Community Television Users and Stations. So we're seeing great work from yourself and the crew over there at Neepawa Access Community TV. So you guys are all working together very, very well. Keep it up. We learn from each other as much as we learn from the experiences we have on our own. And you guys are all really inspiring us here at Telile as we keep going with the material that we're putting out.
And I'm very pleased that part of our programming now is we have an hour set aside every week, and we broadcast content from the portal. We broadcast, it's called Cross Canada Community News, and we draw stories and we show other people's stories on our station.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, that's one of the reasons that we reach out to people like yourself. And earlier on in the program, we had Vicki Hogarth from CHCO and St. Andrews. So we feel that we're all one network of stations working together and of communities working together to make sure
There's
that
not a lot of us community stations left. So we gotta work together on this.
Exactly. Let me ask you as well, Rrain, what can you tell me about one of the greatest joys or greatest satisfaction is for you now? You've talked about being able to come back here after being in Toronto, but what do you think it is about this community that makes it such an exciting place for you being able to be here in this kind of a position as a journalist and as a news director? What's bringing you your joy in this role right now?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the things that I love is, I started doing, for instance, a program called Council Debrief.
Mhm.
And basically, I just take the council meetings and I interpret them. I give a little introduction, I explain what's going on. And to have people in the community come to me and say, that is the first time I've actually understood what they were talking about.
Mm.
It's just so heartwarming for me. Like there's this perceived value in what we're doing here, that what we're doing is important. And that just makes me feel so good about what we're doing here, what we're all doing here.
That's wonderful. We have had that kind of response to the work we're doing for the
Yeah.
LJI here at Telile. Just the idea that, we do have our gavel to gavel coverage, but every so often I will get a member of the public saying to me, you know what, by taking that one bit of discussion and putting it in context and explaining what they were talking about instead of just having it pop up in the middle of a council meeting and not understand
Mhm.
it, that really helped me to know a bit more. So it's great to have that feeling when the community really is responding to how you're breaking down municipal government and making sure it's not so mysterious and not so big and unwieldy, that this is something that affects all of us and that all of us can be a part of.
And I may be the first person who's actually probably read outside of the councils all of the bylaws.
Oh, more power to you. You're going where angels fear to tread by reading all the bylaws. I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't done all that yet.
I'm maybe not quite through, but I'm getting there. There's a lot to learn in there.
Oh my goodness, I believe it. I believe it. Rrain, before we let you go, we want to do something with you that we have done actually with Vicki Hogarth over at CHCO, and that I do
Okay.
regularly with my guests on Telile 24/7. It's called the Fast Five,
Oh
and
dear.
it's
Okay.
very, very straightforward. It's just basically five quick questions, and you tell me the exact thing that comes right into your mind when I ask the question. And, it's very straightforward. I say to everybody I do this with, this is like a final exam that you couldn't possibly fail because it's all about you. And we've done this with everybody from municipal leaders to wardens and mayors and councillors and to different people coming through, cabinet ministers. I've even asked our previous premier, Ian Rankin, here in Nova Scotia, to do a Fast Five with me, and he did pretty well. So
All
I'm
right.
wondering, would you like to join me for the Fast Five?
Let's do it. All
All
right.
right, let's do it. So, first question, very quickly: Coke or Pepsi?
Oh, Diet Pepsi.
Diet Pepsi. There we are. Good, good. Next up, dream vacation.
Oh, actually, cabin in the woods, fireplace, lots of books.
Oh, lovely, lovely. That's terrific. No Wi-Fi?
No Wi-Fi,
Ah,
none, zero.
unplugging. That's the way to do it.
Unplugging,
Yeah,
stack
I
of
like it.
books.
Good stuff. I have watched this movie 10 times. I would gladly watch it another 10. What is that movie?
It's Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park. The
Jurassic
very
Park.
first one.
Very first one.
Why Jurassic Park? Just out of
I
curiosity.
don't know, but every time it's on, I have to watch it.
Are the dinosaurs going to escape again? I won't know unless I watch it
It's
again.
it's a mystery, man. Will they make
That
this bad decision again? Don't do it.
Yep, that's marvelous. All right,
You
you
wanted
can be.
honest answers, right?
Well, that's what I wanted. I wanted an honest answer. That's great. Rrain Pryor, you can be one animal for one day. What is that animal?
Bird.
A bird. What kind
I
of
want to
bird?
fly.
Hey,
Oh, maybe an eagle. Something that's gonna soar in the sky. Yeah,
nicely done. Not a velociraptor.
not a velociraptor.
I'll say eagle is one of our most popular answers for that question. So that's very
Really?
cool that you picked that one as well, too. We all want to soar like eagles. And last question here on the Fast Five. Would you rather be a forest or a tree?
I would rather be a tree.
Why a tree?
I like to be myself, and I often find myself being a little different from the crowd. So I'd be a tree.
That is a great answer. I love that answer. That's it. See, that was the Fast Five. That wasn't so hard,
Yep.
now was it?
It's not hard if you don't like yourself. Think too much. Don't overthink them, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Don't get into the philosophical ramifications of Coke versus Pepsi. It's all okay.
You know what you
Rrain,
like.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Rrain Pryor, it has been an absolute delight to have you join us here on Telile Community Television. We hope that we'll someday be in Neepawa to visit you personally and see the crew there, or that you'll be out here in Cape Breton Island to visit us here in Arichat. But thank you so much for giving me some time today to tell us all about what's going on in Neepawa.
It has been my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
And there you have it. That wraps up this week's edition of Telile 24/7. Thank you for tuning in, and a special thank you to my interview guests this week, Rrain Pryor and Vicki Hogarth. And a big thank you going out to Florence Mitchell of CHCO-TV in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, for filming and formatting the interview segments with Vicki Hogarth. If you have any thoughts or comments on what you've seen over the past hour, or just some ideas for a future edition of Telile 24/7, I'd love to hear them. You can contact me directly. My phone number is 902-625-8863, or you can reach me by email using the address adamjrcook, cook with an E, @gmail.com. You can also contact Telile Community Television directly with your comments and your suggestions. The station phone number in Arichat is 902-226-1928, and the best email address to use is telile@telile.tv. Don't forget to follow Telile Community Television on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and our YouTube channel features every single episode of Telile 24/7, including this one, as well as interviews and segments from our individual shows, and every episode of our sister program, Roundtable. For now, I'm Adam Cooke. Thank you for tuning in this week and for the past 3 years here on Telile 24/7. Our 4th season begins next week with a brand new show. Bye for now.